Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts. Hello, everyone. Here we are in this next edition of Sports Psych Concepts, the lecture series. Thanks for being here. I am going to share with you some interesting info on anxiety in sport, or arousal management, or stress management, sometimes called energy management. Those things are all related to what I'm talking about here, but really what I want to present to you are just some thoughts, maybe we could say some of the theory around how to conceptualize anxiety or dealing with arousal or those nerves, the butterflies, all the different ways that people describe what it is that they're experiencing, how amped up they are before a performance or during a performance, and how we can understand those things, because of course understanding is then what leads to how we design interventions, and we come up with specific tools or drills that we can do to develop skills on the other side of this. So lots of good things to go over. So glad that you're here with me, and we'll plow right into the first topic. And that is just to define arousal itself in this context of what we're talking about. So, as I said, sometimes athletes describe this as just the nerves. They feel nervous, they got the butterflies, they got the jitters. There's many different ways. Maybe you're familiar with other ways that could be described, but really it's just this combination of what's going on physiologically in the person within their body, somatically, but also psychologically. So you got this combination of this activity that someone is feeling, and it's this very real feeling. There's sensation to it. There's an intensity dimension of it, which we can then link into motivation. So we tend to be more amped up or more aroused when motivation is high for some, say it's a rivalry competition, it's a bigger competition, however we've built it up in our mind. Lots of ways that we can look at that, but there's some intensity domain there. And so that motivation, again, it can be on either end of the spectrum here. So it can be motivation because we're really have a strong desire to succeed, or there's motivation we're really nervous because we don't want to fail, right? We don't want to look incompetent or fumble or do something that is not really what we want in front of people if there's people watching, or we don't want to let anybody down. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about here when I talk about arousal. It's on this continuum, right? And truthfully, one other thing I could say on this is that, there's either end of the continuum, and either end isn't necessarily associated with either pleasant or unpleasant events. The context matters a lot, right? And how we interpret that matters a lot. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit more sense as I share a few more thoughts as we keep going. So now that we have arousal broadly defined, let's go a little bit further and hit on anxiety itself. Okay, so anxiety, we can define that as something that is generally unpleasant. Most people don't like feeling anxious, right? You could probably say that pretty much everybody does not like feeling anxiety. It's this unpleasant psychological state. And it's usually in response to something that we perceive. There's some stress in the environment on whether we're able to meet the demands. I mean, that's what stress is. We feel stress when we're not sure if we can meet the demands, or if we're just feeling that those demands are rising, and we have to do something. We have to elevate our performance to meet those demands. Okay, so anxiety is just the unpleasant psychological state that's in response to that stress reaction, right, that we're experiencing. And so like I said, in general, it's some sort of negative emotional state that's attached to it. So that nervousness, worry, or apprehension are some other terms that performers might describe. But I want to pose to you a question to, stimulate a little bit of thinking, and that is all anxiety bad? Even though we describe it as maybe this is an unpleasant thing, it's not like we want to sit there in our anxiety in that anxious state all the time. But is it all bad? And what I'm getting at here is, are there instances where anxiety may actually be able to facilitate performance? And hopefully, as you think about that, you would say, yes, actually, there are instances where anxiety can help our performance. It's not necessarily always negative, but the interpretation of that matters quite a bit, as I'll get into. Okay. But to extend the general idea of anxiety, there's two broad types. So there's state anxiety, and then there is trait anxiety. And I'll go through both of these individual in a moment. But one way to think about this is that anxiety has both cognitive elements and somatic elements. Okay, so the cognitive elements would be, well, those are the thoughts where we're worrying or we're a little bit apprehended or feeling apprehension, right? And the somatic side of it, the more physical side, would be just the degree of perceived physical activation, what it is that we're sensing within our body. So now I want to talk a little bit more about state anxiety that I just introduced here. And essentially, there's the cognitive and the somatic components here, but the state anxiety is just this it's a transient experience. It's contextual. It happens within a moment. So I may be in a state of anxiety at a given moment before a competition or during the competition, maybe after the competition if I'm thinking about it. So that's what I'm talking about when I say state anxiety. Okay, it's this perception of apprehension or tension that usually comes with some sort of activation of our autonomic nervous system, right? Your heart rate's going to go up, your respiratory rate, sweat rate, all of those different things that you feel. Okay, that's part of it. So you have the cognitive component, which is just the degree of worry or those negative thoughts, and then the somatic state is our perception of those things going on with the autonomic nervous system. Okay, and this is, like I said, it changes from moment to moment. So if you think about a classic example here, if you're a runner at a track meet, for example, or say a cross country meet or a road race, anything like that, before the race, the anxiety tends to go through this crescendo. It increases right up until about the moment of the race. Anxiety is high, but once the gun goes and you take off and you're running, that anxiety drops significantly. And you hear those types of performers often saying, "Oh, I just want it to start already. I just want to get going," and that captures that pretty perfectly. Now, there's three other components that I want to outline here for you. Well, there's one other component that's in addition to the other components. So I mentioned cognitive state anxiety, somatic state anxiety. So the third component is the perceived control, and this is, we could describe this as what will we call it? The regulatory component. Okay, it's the degree to which the performer believes that they have the resources or the ability to meet the challenge. Okay, so all of those things factoring together are going to determine sort of this like experience of anxiety in that moment that the performer has. Now let's talk about trait anxiety. Okay, so everybody experiences anxiety at different times, and so we would call that state anxiety, right? There's just different situations that we encounter where we experience that, but some of us experience anxiety more than others. And those of us who do could be described as having trait anxiety, to where this is more built into our personality. We're more of a chronic worrier. We have this tendency to worry about different things, even things that maybe aren't really totally relevant to what we are dealing with or what it is that we're doing. It could be we just get really bothered by things that others are doing, and we get a little bit more anxious for them, even maybe more anxious than they are. And so that could be indicative of trait anxiety. And oftentimes we see it as the anxiety, even if it's like state anxiety in a moment. Okay, so trait anxiety, someone tends to be more anxious more than others. State anxiety is just how anxious they are in a particular moment, and it tends to be more anxious, or it's disproportionate to what it is that's going on. They'll get more worked up over something that maybe others don't think is as big of a deal, just in general, right? This isn't some universal blanket statement. There's just these tendencies that we happen to see in individuals who score higher on trait anxiety. So now that we've talked about arousal, we've talked about anxiety and the different components, I want to hit on stress once again, just to extend it a little bit more, because I know I briefly mentioned it already. But as I said, the way to think about this is we're put in some situation in the environment where there's a demand placed on us, and we perceive that demand. How we perceive that demand determines whether we or the magnitude of the stress response that we get. And then there's whatever behavioral consequence that comes from that. Okay, and then we go through this sort of stress cycle. Okay, but stress is essentially, it's when there's a substantial imbalance between that demand, whether that's a physical or a psychological or social demand, and then our capability to respond to that, especially when the consequences are important. So we could be in a situation where we don't really care if we are capable of doing the thing that's demanded upon us in the environment, because it's not, the consequences aren't that important to us. It just doesn't really matter. It's like, who gives a flying anything, because it's nothing's going to happen if we don't do that. Okay. But like I said, we can think of the whole stress process as like this sequence thing that has these 4 steps. So like I said, there's this environmental demand that's placed on someone, and like if it's a physical demand, we would be needing to execute a certain level of skill, perhaps in front of people. And then the psychological demand would be, well, I'm trying to please a college recruit, a pro scout, something like that. Maybe even I'm just trying to please my parents, and so I'm feeling those demands. Okay, and then there's our perception of it. So we don't perceive those demands the same way. It could be the same situation, but now let's say, well, it's my teammates and we're both at this competition. We both want to perform well for our dad. Our dads are there, and my dad puts a more pressure on me than my teammate's dad, and so maybe we perceive that differently, and so it affects how stressed we feel or how we respond, right? Some of us like being in the spotlight, while others maybe don't. And how we perceive the demand is highly influenced by whether we have, high trait anxiety, as I talked about that, right? So then if we perceive that our capability is lower than the demand, then we're going to experience more of that anxiety, right? If we're perceiving that, oh, I got this, I'm fine, right? We're not going to feel as anxious. But if we're not really sure, maybe there's a 50-50 chance, we don't know, we experience more of that state anxiety, either cognitively and how we're thinking about it, or somatically, what's going on with our body physically. And sometimes we'll lose focus, right? We experience tension, different things that can interfere with our performance, and that's the behavioral consequence. Okay, so if I have a high stress response in general, how's that going to affect my performance? Right? It's often going to make it worse, which makes sense for a lot of performers. That's the case. We need to be able to manage that. And so then whatever happens there, then that feeds back into our performance in the first situation, right? Then there's this environmental demand. There's still these things there, but then I already went through the cycle once, and now it can it's like almost like the stress is even higher than maybe it was the first round. Okay, there's just one way to think about it. Now, some implications for everything that I've shared here for you to think about. We can use these different stages or phases to kind of identify things in each step along the way that might affect the athlete and how they might affect the athlete. And then we can design different interventions for stress management around this. Okay, so is it there's something environmental, what's going on in the environment? Is there anything that we can do to influence that? Or is it just how we're perceiving things in the situation, and then so we could maybe reframe and change our perception, or we're experiencing a stress response, so how do we manage the stress response? How do we cope with that? So that's the whole point, right? Is how we have that understanding of what's going on, so then we can design targeted interventions to help our performers. So with that, I want you to think about something, related to your own experiences with sport or other performance domains, we could say here, and just what stresses you out. What are the sorts of things that come to mind for you? Or we could say, what stresses out performers? What if we had to make a list, what might be some of the things that we would identify are going to lead to stress in our performers in those different situations? And if we came up with a list, there's probably thousands of things that we could identify here, but I want to try and categorize it for you to simplify it in your mind and narrow this down a little bit further. So if we're going to categorize everything into two common sources of where stress comes from, all of those specific things, we could say there's situations that cause stress, and then there's personality components that contribute to stress. Okay, so the first situational thing would be just the event importance. So generally, the more important an event is, the more stressful it tends to be. The more critical the situation, if we're within a particular event, the more stress that we tend to experience. Okay, in general. So this isn't always apparent. So some events, maybe they're more important to some individuals than others. Like again, you just go back to the classic example. If you're working with youth sport athletes or high school athletes, when their parents are watching someone important to them, that's more important than maybe a competition where they're not there. Yeah, like I said, if there's college scouts watching, maybe it's a senior night performance. We could go down the list there and identify a lot of different things. Okay, so the general rule of event importance stands, but there's a lot of individual variation on what determines the level of importance. Okay, so then the other situation, broad situation that stresses people out is uncertainty, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about sport is that we don't know what the outcome's going to be. So it makes it exciting to be a spectator to watch those things and even for participants. So a lot of athletes, that's why they participate. They love that because they're challenging themselves. They don't know what's going to happen as the event unfolds, and that's really cool. And at the same time, that uncertainty, it leads to stress. Like the unknown is not like the most comfortable thing. So some of us can lean into that within the context of a sports competition, maybe a little bit more capably than others, but in general, right, the greater uncertainty, the greater the stress. And the interesting thing about all of this that ties into what I was just saying is we experience the most uncertainty when there's two evenly matched opponents or teams competing. Who's like, we don't know. They're evenly matched. It's amazing. And so the question I have on this is, well, do we really need to do anything about that? Right? And it's like, well, probably not. That is what sport is all about. Okay. But we can reduce uncertainty in other areas that may cause athletes stress. Okay. So think of some examples here. Like some athletes, it can help them if they know all of their travel departure times, or if they know starting lineups in advance rather than finding out just before the game. They know what an injury rehab protocol is. They know what practice agendas are. Those sorts of things. You can eliminate uncertainty, and all these other areas that you have much more control over. And that can help the athletes focus on managing the stress that they're experiencing from the uncertainty of the competition. Okay, so this is now here's another thing with this too, because sometimes if you provide too much certainty, too much information ahead, this can actually lead to stress. So I've worked with athletes where that has been the case. Some athletes really appreciate having a training plan that's mapped out for the entire season. They have some sort of general idea of what it is that they're going to do through their season and throughout their progression. They love that. It reduces stress. And then they could have a teammate that just gives them stress. Like all they want to know is what's coming next. And so it's very, very important to understand the unique individual considerations that we need to take into account there. Now, so personality is the next one, right? We have situations, important ones, uncertain ones. Then we have personality. So trait anxiety, I mentioned this. Those who rate high on this, they'll actually have what's called a cognitive bias to notice more threat related info in some situations that, well, I guess I should say in the same situations as some of their peers or teammates who have lower trait anxiety. Okay, so they notice those things that are going to get them, or the things that could go wrong, right? They tend to fixate on those things that could go wrong more than those who rate lower on trait anxiety. So that can be a key contributor for sure. Next, we have self-esteem, which the way to think about this is really it's someone's social barometer. It's how we think others view us, right? Our perception of how we think others perceive us. And so if we have lower self-esteem, then that leads to less confidence and more state anxiety. And so athletes who are struggling with these sorts of challenges, they need interventions that are aimed at boosting their confidence, building them up so they have that better perspective of who they are and what they can contribute, and that can help raise their self-esteem as well. Okay, and then one other thing that I want to mention on this related to personality would be social physique anxiety, because this is an interesting one, and I've seen this with some athletes, and essentially it's just how anxious we get when others observe our physique. They evaluate our bodies, or we just perceive them evaluating our physique or seeing us, right? And this is the thing in athletic competition and in sports. It's like there's certain sports where we're showing more of our body, our physique, than some other ones in what it is that we're wearing for competition. And some athletes, this can lead to considerable anxiety, right? If they so for example, if you have an athlete with this type of anxiety, they might just avoid fitness evaluations or struggle with different types of motivation. They don't want to work out in a specific setting. And so it's very, very interesting. And there could be some, you know, gendered components here. Maybe we see more of this in women's athletics than men's athletics. But I as soon as I say that, I recall a funny story, because I've competed in a lot of different competitions, and I recall going to the starting line of a half marathon with a buddy of mine, and we were thinking we're going to have a competitive chance to win and be in the race, either of us be up there at the top. And we saw how we would describe him at the time, kind of a gangly looking guy who ran kind of lopey, wasn't your sort of classic physique, didn't have the classic body of a runner that you would look at and think, oh, at least we wouldn't look at him and think, yeah, that guy knows what he's doing. And I remember making a joke about this guy kind of running through the parking lot, and I said, you think that guy thinks he's going to win? And we kind of chuckled, like thinking there's no way he was going to win. And guess who won the race? Guess who won the race? We ate our words on that one beautifully, because that dude smoked us in that competition. And it was just maybe a little bit of our own social physique anxiety coming out that we were projecting onto this other guy who then went out and ran a lot faster than us. So there may be a gendered component to that, but not completely. Okay, so now that I have shared some of these, foundational ideas on what stresses us out, I want to shift a little bit more and talk about how anxiety and the arousal that we're experiencing may be linked to performance. And so the first theory that I'm going to share with you is called drive theory. Now, in general, like sometimes I think I actually debated on whether I wanted to include this in the recording because drive theory isn't really well adopted in the sports psychology space anymore. It was kind of an initial idea that helped stimulate some thinking and some evolution of the theory on this, but it's not like this well supported theory in the literature. But you'll see why I'm sharing this. So essentially, it was one of the first theories to help explain the relationship between stress or arousal and anxiety and our performance, because there's some sort of relationship there. And so the initial idea was that the more amped up you get, the higher your performance climbs, the better you perform, the more psyched up you are leading into a competition. Okay, but if we think about that critically, we say, well, hold on a second, that doesn't totally make sense. You can overshoot that. Like I've been too amped up before in a competition where I overshot and I actually performed worse because I was more excited than I needed to be, more aroused going into the competition. And so that's actually the case, right? It makes sense, and so this isn't supported very well empirically. However, there may be some instances where this does make sense. So you think about social facilitation theory, the idea that you have other people cheering for you and rooting for you, and they're there for you to accomplish this particular task or whatever it is you're doing in competition, and that can help us achieve greater heights than we would have performed just on our own. So maybe that kind of lines up. Or we can think of specific examples, specific tasks where this might be the case. So think about doing a heavy deadlift exercise where you need to get so amped up, and if you watch videos of top performers doing this, they've got smelling salts and they got people slapping them and grabbing them and doing all this, yelling at them to get them as amped up as they possibly can so they can recruit every last muscle fiber to get that weight off of the floor. So in that instance, well, yeah, drive theory, maybe that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so there are some instances where maybe this would apply, but it's not this broad umbrella at all. And so as a sort of evolved version, then we have the inverted U hypothesis. And this has been around for a while, and there's different ways that this is described. Sometimes you'll see this as the Yerkes-Dodson law, but it's the inverted U. Okay, so you've got this upside down U. So as physiological arousal rises, performance will rise to a point. But then if arousal goes beyond that, then performance will continue to come down. Okay, so the idea here is that there's an optimal level of arousal. So if you think about your own experiences or experiences of performers you're aware of, we've often experienced being underamped or overamped. And so this theory, the idea is that the middle zone is the ideal. Okay, but again, you can think, well, is that really true for everybody? I mean, is it the just a moderate amount of arousal is what's best for everybody? Is that really how this works? And so there's limitations to this. The idea is a beautiful idea, but there's limitations of it to adopt it wholesale because it doesn't consider sport or individual characteristics. And so we could say, well, maybe it actually it looks different. There's different curves for different sports, different types of tasks, and different individuals. So one individual, maybe it follows the inverted U, but their sweet spot, their middle ground is actually a higher level of arousal than another athlete. And then if you have a more skilled athlete, maybe they can tolerate higher levels of arousal than a less skilled athlete. Say a more novice athlete, they're not going to be able to tolerate as much, right? Or it's like a shooting sport like archery compared to golf or tennis or basketball or the weightlifting example. And so then each of those things could have their own curve. And so this is well, hopefully shows you how nuanced this really is that we need to take in individual characteristics, and then that can maybe help us understand where they are. Which leads nicely into Yuri Hannon's individual zones of optimal functioning, or the IZOF. And this is really one of the more widely studied models related to, you know, performers' subjective experiences that they have in sport. But just the way to think about this is that the top athletes will have a zone that their top performances occur. Okay, and outside that zone leads to poor performances. We could say top, but we could really say any athlete, not just the top athletes. Okay, so one athlete, it might be their peak performance zone might be a lower level of arousal or anxiety. And then another athlete, it might be in the middle. Another athlete, yet again, may be way up higher. They need to get more amped up. So the optimal zone doesn't always occur at the midpoint of the continuum. It's gonna vary by the individual. And then in addition to that, the optimal zone, it isn't some single point. It's like this bandwidth or this range. And coaches, one of their primary tasks, and mental performance consultants, one of their primary tasks is to help athletes find what their zone is, find that range, and then find where the out of bounds is. Is out of bounds below that? Is it above it? It's like, where is their sweet spot? That's what this individual zone of optimal functioning is all about. It's helping those athletes find where their bandwidth of optimal performance is, and then figuring out what it is that they need to do to get into that in the first place, but then also stay in that. Or if then they fall out of that zone during the things that happen within a competition or a performance, then they have skills and tools to pull themselves back in. So hopefully you can see how the theory, right, the foundational idea here then is what informs the interventions on the other end. Okay, so one more thing I want to mention related to the inverted U, right? We have the individual zones of optimal functioning, which is maybe a more practical way, but there's this idea of the catastrophe phenomenon where it's like maybe it's not really an inverted U, where there's just this sort of gradual increase up, and then we find the sweet spot in the midpoint of the continuum for the athlete, and then there's kind of this gradual decline for their performance. The catastrophe phenomenon is based on so many examples that we see in athletes where they get they overshoot their optimal level of arousal, anxiety, stress, whatever. They get so psyched up or amped up that then a catastrophe occurs in relation to their performance. And so there's just this incredible dip in their performance once they hit a certain level of arousal. Rather than this sort of gradual decline, it's like, no, catastrophe hits, it falls off the face of the map, and their plummet falls off the face of the map. And so there's several things that can contribute to this, okay? Because if we think about the inverted U, maybe it holds pretty well for somatic anxiety, okay, but not as well if someone has high cognitive state anxiety. Okay, when their cognitive anxiety is high, then we may see their performance improve, like the inverted U, up to a certain threshold. And at that point, that's when that rapid decline happens. Okay, so it's really important to understand this, because once that catastrophe occurs, then it's not just a matter of slightly reducing their arousal to regain their performance. They have to greatly reduce that. And so there's different techniques that feed into this. Hopefully you can see why I'm sharing this, right? It's like understanding this. Whoa, they fell off the cliff. It's not just like a gradual cool down here to bring them back to where they were. Like when they need to cool off, it's like, okay, we need to get them way back down. So how can we do that? We can help them relax physically. We could use cognitive restructuring things about their worries, things that's going on mentally in their mind, help them boost some confidence. And then once they get their arousal level back into a more manageable state, then we try and rouse them back up to that optimal zone in a more controlled way, right? Or we help them do that. Now, this is hard. And it's why a lot of athletes, like after they go off that cliff in their performance, like they never recover. Okay. They never recover. But it is possible, right? It is possible, and I've seen it happen with some athletes where they experienced a catastrophe in a competition, and then this was a track athlete. Catastrophe happened. The athlete still had a chance, but just was lost it emotionally, wasn't able to finish a race, and that was a good race for this athlete to be able to compete and should have medaled, all of that in a championship, conference championship event, and then had to come back down, and somehow an hour later came back and medaled in a different race, right? It was amazing, but it was just lived this process. It was a real thing. Okay. So the main takeaway of this before I move on to the next main point is that we need high physiological arousal, right? And a certain amount of worry, but we have to pay attention to the worry piece. If the cognitive anxiety becomes too great to be able to manage, then that's when this tends to happen more. All right, so now I want to mention something that I've alluded to already, and I want to just drive it home to you, and that is this. It's just a key point that how we interpret our anxiety matters a lot. Okay, our interpretation of those symptoms matters. So if we interpret, I mean, well, we really have two options, right? We can interpret anxiety as either positive and helpful, which we'd say is a facilitative interpretation, or it's negative and detrimental, which that would be debilitative to our performance. Okay, so we need to look at not just the intensity, but this interpretation piece. And if we view anxiety as a facilitative thing, like, oh, I don't necessarily like this, but I know it's necessary, then that's what helps performance. So, which begs the question, well, how much control do we really have with this? Can we cope with anxiety? Can we actually do it? Is the goal possible? And so we have this perception of control with respect to how we're coping and whether we can achieve the goal, and that's really the critical piece to determining whether the anxiety is helpful or harmful, right? How much control do we have, and what is our perception of control over that? Okay, and so if we do feel like we have some control, we perceive that we can do that, we tend to view the anxiety as a positive thing. But if we view situations as threats, or we don't have as much control, then that tends to be more problematic, and we see anxiety as debilitative. Okay, but if we view a situation as a challenge as opposed to a threat, which this is the key difference between elite and sub-elite athletes, by the way, is that elite athletes view hard situations as a challenge. And yes, I have some control over this. And so that anxiety, that they still experience it, but they experience it as a facilitative thing that's going to help them achieve their best performance. Whereas sub-elite athletes, everything's a threat. I don't know if I have as much control. Anxiety is bad. I want anxiety to go away. Get me out of here. Performance isn't as good. Okay, so this is important, and it will lead into the final thing that I'm gonna mention here, the final few things, and that's just like, well, all right, so we understand anxiety, arousal, stress, those different concepts, how we can kind of interpret them, different models. We know how important it is to interpret anxiety itself. And so the question is, well, can athletes then learn how to do it? And if so, how do they do it? Like, what tools do we have available to us? And of course, they're all the classic sports psychology things like that are a part of psychological skills training or mental skills training, which self-talk or relaxation, imagery, things like goal setting, all of those things. But before I jump into some of those useful tools, I want to mention, maybe a little bit more of why arousal influences performance, and this I'll just be brief on it because I know I already kind of hinted at it. And we tense up. We experience some fatigue, like mental fatigue. Maybe we're not as coordinated because we're tensed up and we're not focused on the right things. And you hear athletes say that. Maybe their attention or concentration or their visual search strategies aren't as good. So if they're like super amped up, then they'll have more of a narrow attention focus, and so they could miss important cues. Or maybe they're just not amped up enough, and so their attention is too broadly spread out, right? We're paying attention to unimportant things. We're paying attention to the crowd, things that don't matter, but then that's going to have some effect on our performance. Okay. And so arousal, anxiety, these things, it affects what we concentrate on. And there's different things that can lead to that, what we'll call cognitive interference. Okay, the things we're thinking about. So it can be we're worried about our performance, or we're worried about things that are in the situation, but they're irrelevant to our performance. So that would be the fans or the crowd or whatever, or what you're going to have for dinner after the game. Or we have thoughts of escape, like I want to get out of here, I want this to be over, just get me home, right? And so it's very interesting because we can actually study, you can see this, there's research done on this. You look at quiet eye and some of the other things that look at visual search changes. So if athletes are in a situation they're perceiving it as a high threat, the efficiency of our eye gaze or where we're looking tends to be disrupted. So we don't fixate on the right things, or if we do, we don't fixate long enough. Okay, so I think about examples like basketball shooting a free throw, or golf focusing on are we paying attention to making contact with the ball, or is our head lifting, or with the wind, or whatever, these other things that maybe those things matter at some point, but once you get to the execution of the skill, especially these closed skills, then we don't want to be, we don't want our eyes wandering in those moments. All right, so I've gone over a lot in this recording, and I want to wrap it all up with with some tools, right? How do we actually use the information? Well, the first step is to determine a performer's optimal, temperature with regards to emotion. Okay, what's their optimal emotional temperature? And then once we kind of understand that, like this thermostat idea, we can develop skills to regulate the athlete's temperature. Okay, and I have other recordings that are available on the channel that you can listen to, or I'll go into more details on those things. Okay, but it's just that's why I mentioned at the beginning, and I've had a common thread throughout this recording, is we need to understand the foundational thing first to be able to come up with the tools to develop the skill in the athlete. So let's figure out where they're at. Some athletes run hot, some athletes are cold, some are in the middle. We need to treat them as individuals, so we can help coaches in this regard, because a lot of coaches will respond to athletes in the same way, that may be the way that worked for them when they were coaches, and they're not taking the individual into account on that. Okay, we also need to understand how personal and social or situational factors interact. So if someone does score high on trait anxiety, like that's important, but we can't assume that that's the only factor. We need to know that both of these things are at play. It's not well, they're just an anxious person, and so there's nothing you can do about it. It's like, well, what can we do in the situation to help manage that, to keep them in their optimal emotional temperature? And so looking at the situation a little bit differently can be just a helpful first step. We also need to be able to recognize the signs of arousal. Now, the interesting thing about this is that a lot of coaches aren't really that good at identifying an athlete's anxiety level. Some of them might say that they are, but then if you were to cross-reference those and they're actually to score themselves, the athlete does and then the coach does, it's not super accurate. And so coaches and practitioners could benefit by doing this. Like, well, what are the signs? What are the sorts of things that you feel? And this is one of those things that coaches should ask about, because some athletes, it might just be the cold, clammy hands. Like, well, you can't see that, really. Maybe if they're sweating profusely, which could be another side, but you can't see if someone's feeling muscle tension. Perhaps some, you could argue that maybe you can see that on them in their face or body language. I mean, there are different things, but we a lot of times get that wrong, right? The butterflies, does someone have cotton mouth, frequent trips to the bathroom? Like, we don't always know exactly how it is for every athlete. There's going to be some overlap there, but we need to look for changes in these things from practice to competition or environment and see how that might be different, and that can give us clues as to what athletes might be experiencing on an individual level for these things. And then ultimately we need to use an individualized approach. Okay, so some athletes need to be psyched up, some need to be cooled off, and others in the middle. And that's the most important takeaway from all of this, is that every athlete doesn't respond the same. There's going to be some similarities in certain athletes and contexts and all of that. Of course, there can be some general ideas that we can use to inform what we're doing, but we really need to take into account the individual so we can amp them up if that's what they need, or rev them down if that's what they need, or just find that sweet spot. So that is all I have for this presentation. So I appreciate you listening all the way to the end, and hopefully you learned something. Take care until next time. Thank you for listening to this recording. I hope you learned something about sports psych, perhaps something you didn't know before, and maybe even something you can apply in your life more generally. If you liked what you heard, feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit my website at fehradvantage.com, or visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify.